Welcome to the Lion Zone, where you learn to be a lion and not the prey in a world of hungry jackals and vicious wolves. I'm your host, Steve Johan. For more about me, visit me at stevejohan.com and find me on Substack under stevejohan.substack.com. I've got another great show lined up for you. Sorry about the delay, but we've had some technical difficulties, but it's going to be well worth your wait. Today, I have a special guest, somebody I've admired for many years. His name is James Perloff. He's an investigative journalist since 1986. Boy, I wasn't doing anything in that kind of realm at all at that time. But when he began writing for the New American magazine, he is the author of 8 books, including The Shadows of Power, an expose on the Council on Foreign Relations that has sold well over 100,000 copies. The 2 books about the evidence against Darwin's theory of evolution. His 2013 book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and is a comprehensive primer on the New World Order, supplemented by his 2019 book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. His 2020 book, COVID-19 and the Agenda to Come, Red Pilled, was Amazon's #1 bestseller, and guess what? In the category under respiratory, get that out, diseases for 2 months until they banned it. Can you imagine that? And in 2022, he wrote Missing Saints, Missing Miracles. His newest book, published this July, is called Exploding the Official Myths of the Lincoln Assassination. He's a blogger, a frequent podcast guest, and his website is www.jamesperloff.net, and you can find him on Twitter and Gab under James Perloff. So, James, thanks for joining me on the Lion Zone.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to apologize to the guest. My computer was destroyed this past month, and I had to 2 days before I head to Michigan to give a major PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if it's a coincidence or deliberate, but I was able to go out and buy a new laptop, and the Michigan presentation, which I'll post on my website soon, went great. But one thing I forgot about is I hadn't done any Zoom meetings on this new computer, and so it took me some time to coordinate my equipment with your Zoom invitation. I'm sorry about that. I apologize to any of your listeners and viewers who may have had to experience a delay.
Don't worry about it. Good things take a little time, and it's all worth the wait. So, James, for those of my audience that do not know who you are, tell me a little bit about yourself. I know you work for the New American magazine, but how did that come about? I mean, how did the doors open for a young man like yourself back in those days to get involved with the New American, and then that progression of how it led you forward to what you've been doing since that time?
Well, sure. Well, I was a hippie, early 1970s, anti-Vietnam War. Didn't really understand the underpinnings of forces driving American politics and foreign policy. And in 1978, I saw a girl who was reading a book by Gary Allen called Nunda, called A Conspiracy. And this is the kind of experience I only have once every 10 years or so, but something told me, you've got to read that book. I saw the cover. I said, you've got to find that book. So I walked to a bookstore, and there, right on the bookshelf, I found it. And that book completely changed my perspective on history. It showed history was unfolding according to a certain agenda run by a very powerful oligarchy, rather than being the random unfolding of events that I'd been taught was the story of history in public school. So I found out that at that time, the primary organized group fighting against this oligarchy was the John Birch Society, who happened to have their headquarters pretty close to where I lived at that time in Massachusetts. And so I became a member, and I started writing for their magazine, and started writing books. As I advanced, I became very interested in the creation evolution debate. Wrote a couple of books on that, because when I grew up in an atheist home, and when I became a Christian, I said, well, what's the true story of man's origin? Is it according to Charles Darwin, or is it according to what the Bible says? And I found that Charles Darwin's theory was a house of cards So I wrote a couple of books on that, and uh, I was actually going on about three podcasts and radio shows a week to talk about that book when in 2001 9/11 hit. Of course, nobody wanted to talk about creation and evolution after that. To think about 9/11, and that's when I began to discover the Zionist Israeli role in this whole New World Order thing. I knew about the Fed before that and the Council of Foreign Relations of the UN, things like that, but then I started to learn about Zionism. We're all on a learning curve, and for me, it's been about the pursuit of truth, whether it's religious, spiritual, or political. Um, Everything is actually very consistent throughout history. You'll find that there has been a constant drive to consolidate power, whether it's consolidation of businesses through mergers, or the consolidation of religions through what they call ecumenicism, or the consolidation of countries such as the European Union consolidating into one bloc, which eventually is supposed to lead us into one government, a world government leading the whole world. It's very consistent. And my talk in Michigan was really about how World War One and World War Two not only connected to each other, but connect to today, um, advancing Zionism, globalism, and communism. Um, so that's kind of where I've been at. I became an Orthodox Christian in 2020. I'm sorry, 2017. I wrote a book about why we don't see miracles today, called "Missing Saints, Missing Miracles" in 2022. And again, my most recent book, which came out, one that I was kind of eager to write, is "Exploding the Official Myths of the Lincoln Assassination." We hear a lot about the Kennedy assassination in recent years, but not too much about um, the Lincoln assassination. So that kind of brings us up to date. And I do a lot of podcasts to talk about this stuff and where we're headed as a nation and as a world, which mostly seems to be downhill in recent years.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I got a lot of it's kind of interesting because a lot of the concepts, the subject matter that you have written on, I I've read and I've been consuming myself now for several years. And prior to that, excuse me, prior to that, I came to Christ in 1980. So I've really focused my energies a lot on that area, on just really developing a relationship with the Lord, a depth of knowledge. I do a lot of teaching. But as far as the world goes, I'm okay, I'm conservative, I vote Republican, blah, blah, blah. I did that for years, listened to political shows, the Pragers, the Medveds, these kind of people. I always enjoyed it more when they did interviews than when they stayed on their hobby horses. I always enjoyed interviews. I remember back in 1980, my first real job in the electronics world, and I was a draftsman, and I had a little radio, and I would listen to some of the local talk shows out of Seattle. And the best shows were always when they did interviews, and they would have a variety of individuals that were authors, subject matter, and it was pretty much an open world of what somebody maybe like yourself would have been interviewed back in those days. But I got into, boy, this is a great way to learn. And I read. I'm a voracious reader. But it wasn't until I had my epiphany in 2015, where God literally woke me up the morning that Trump we heard on the news, Trump's won the election. And God literally said, turn off the news, turn off all politics, stop. And I go, okay, I'm going to do that. So I turned off the news. I said, honey, I don't want to listen to the news anymore. And I quit listening to political talk shows. I came to work, turned on my computer, started working, popped up YouTube to listen to, hold on here, listen to some music. And there was a little thing on the corner, on the little selection. It said 9/11. I go, it's 2015. What's 9/11? I clicked it and I went down the rabbit hole from that point on. And so I even wrote my own book, which actually I'm rewriting right now. So I'm not going to promote it until that's done. But James, I just want to ask you some questions because you've delved in deeply into some of the subject matter that I've been learning about, I'm like, well, James has already been down this road. He's already been talking about that. But you talked about None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. Is that what you said? The first book that you read?
Yeah, by Gary Allen, helped with Larry Abraham. Yep. 1976, I think, was the edition I read.
Would you say that book is still relevant to anybody who wants to understand things?
Sure, very, very much so. Again, it talks about false flags, the League of Nations, the UN, Council on Foreign Relations, the creation of the Federal Reserve, um, the aim for world government. It's very, very relevant. It doesn't talk about everything. It doesn't talk about, Zionism, Israel, and some few other topics that I think are relevant. Some things that have developed since then, such as COVID and climate change. But yes, definitely a landmark book in helping people. And I understand that that book actually sold in the millions of copies at the time, back in the 1970s. And when I was working in a hospital at the time, I used to hand the book out to the people on the night shift. Said, "Listen, you got some spare time? Take a look at this book. Great book."
That this is what I've discovered. I when I on my hunt in my own research, I came across Smedley Butler's War is a Racket.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
and
Mm.
I read that and I went, I will never see war the same again. And then I read the Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And matter of fact, he's going to be on my show next week, which is really, really
Really?
cool.
Wow.
Um, but I read those two books. Those two books for me in my early days of research just nailed it. And I said, oh gosh, every war. And then I stopped and I went, I think the Holy Spirit just said, Steve, every war is about pillaging, plundering, rape, murder, taking over assets, distribution rights, land grabs, you name it. It's not about what they tell you because it's like, so I woke up, I looked at the whole military machine, the industrial military complex by a guy who, by the way, was part of that and did quite a lot of damage himself, Mr. Eisenhower, when he was in the military. But the point is, these, like you said, these trends, these cycles, this idea of empire, empires come, go, come, go, come, go, but it's all about consolidation of power, oppressing the poor, and making a handful of the rich very wealthy. Is that kind of the history of mankind?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that would be that there's a dimension of spiritual warfare involved in this, which is um, although money is used by the elite to um, get what they want. I'll give you an example of that. Around 1890, the Attorney General of Ohio was threatening Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, which was headquartered in Ohio, with an antitrust lawsuit. And so they went to him and they said, "We'll give you $100,000 to drop this suit. But if you don't, we'll consign you to oblivion." He refused the bribe and he was consigned to oblivion. He was replaced by another man. You find all the details of this in the book America's 60 Families, published by Ferdinand Lundberg in 1937. But in any event, getting back to 1890, a new attorney general came on board who was also going to press this suit, this antitrust suit. The Rockefellers offered him $400,000. He refused the bribe. He was fired. He was consigned to oblivion. The next guy took the bribe. And that's how these guys operate. But I don't believe that it's just about money and power. They know that money and power can fire newscasters and media people to do what they want. But I think at the top, uppermost level, this thing is really satanic, a battle between good versus evil, if I may say so. Because these people, to make money, you can actually do good things. You can make good products and sell them and make money that way. You don't have to oppress people and abort them and cheat and lie and send people to unnecessary wars in order to make money. You can find better ways to do that. So this was actually a battle of good versus evil, if you will, Satan versus God.
It's interesting you say that. I have taught a lot of classes on that. I'm actually right now compiling my next book, my next whatever you want to call it, Kingdoms in Conflict, and I am bringing in this whole that there's no way you can explain what goes on in this world without understanding that there is a spiritual battle, and that the elites, the guys at the top, they literally are puppets of large, Paul says in Ephesians 6, there's what, rulers, authorities, principalities, spiritual beings in the heavenlies, and they all have different echelons, and they have control over territories in this world, and they rule. And of course, Christ came, he's sitting at the throne of God, right hand of God, and his kingdom is breaking into all these kingdoms. But this is an ongoing battle. And the people at the top, they literally worship these beings. It could be Baal, it could be Moloch, it could be, you see you see this reflected in pop music and rock music, and you can also see it in all the literature. You can see it in the symbolism of Masonic literature. You can see it even the Catholic Church. When you go to you start looking at symbolism in the Vatican, and you look beyond, and you look at other religions, but you look at what these individuals do, and they actually need blood sacrifices. And those blood sacrifices come in the form of abortions, like you said. They come in the form of endless wars. They come in the form of just ongoing murders, and this. There is a connection, a direct connection. And then they also do incantation. And that's one thing about the alternative media, is a lot of people have become more and more awake of this. David Icke said, oh, they're lizard people, but he actually says, no, this is interdimensional beings. We're not dealing with just human beings. We're dealing with interdimensional, which is spiritual beings. And he understands that. And a lot of religions incorporate this and understand that. There's no way you can explain the blindness of congressional members who go in and say, I love Jesus, but I'm going to support Israel. And we're going to have endless bloodshed. We're going to pulverize any of their enemies. And I'm like, do you not know that the covenant is a new covenant, that Israel is no longer a part of the plan, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the plan, that the people over there, they're blind because of indoctrination that began, by the way, I don't know if you've thought about this, but in the 1800s, dispensationalism, Mormonism, Darwinism, Marxism, I think Jehovah Witness, all came out of that era. Those are strange teachings that have all come in from that one century, which then those influential spirits, Paul calls them doctrines of demons because there's a spirit attached to those things, took over the world and has deeply influenced billions of people's lives, all based on demonic teachings. And that's what we're seeing. So you're right. It's not just these guys got more power and more money than you can ever want. It's far beyond that. So reflect on what I just said there.
Well, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson. It came out in 1974.
Yes.
It was about a plot by the wealthy to use funds for a dam to gain control of land that they'd made worthless in the California Valley through an artificially created drought. So they could buy it up for peanuts and then use this dam by incorporating the valley into the county of Los Angeles, and then they would all become very rich. But at one point, sort of a climactic scene, Jack Nicholson is confronting the main bad guy played by John Huston. He says, what do you get out of this? I mean, can you eat? You're already worth millions of dollars. Can you eat at better restaurants? Can you wear better clothes? What can you get that you haven't already got? John Huston says, the future, Mr. Gitz, the future. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, guys like Bill Gates, they can't eat better lobster than they're already eating right now. We've already got, magnificent mansions with built-in movie projectors and bowling alleys or whatnot. So there's a kind of limit on how much material pleasure they can get. It's deeper than that. It's spiritual. Um, and a lot of these people, and I often think of Hollywood and music stars, in order to get to the top of where they are, they have to make a kind of a deal with the devil and promise to um, do very immoral things in exchange for lust for fame. And of course, the Bible warns us about not having humility, warns us about vanity as a very great sin. But the devil knows he can tempt people with that. Um, but yeah, it's about it is really at its root, it's about good versus evil.
Yeah, I'm. It, it is an amazing thing, and I just from your perspective, do you believe that more and more people are actually waking up to this fact that there is that what used to be on the fringes, the John Birch Society, the alternative media, that more and more people are understanding that there is a heavy spiritual component with the whole occultism and the use of babies and all that. Do you see a rising, not as a general rule, but as a in your 30 years of doing what you're doing, are you seeing more interest, or are you seeing kind of the same people just saying the same thing?
A lot of people are the same, but interesting conversation I had when I came with my COVID book. I had to start independently selling that in three distributors since Amazon banned it after 2 months. Um, there was one group of people out in California who called me up and they said, a year ago, if we talked about COVID, people would just shake their hands and say we're crazy. But now I find that people want to know this stuff, and they were buying dozens of copies of my book on COVID. So in their eyes, more people waking up, and I do meet more and more people at church, for example, who are awake, but I also meet a lot of people who are still asleep, and that includes regardless of which church you're in, whether it's Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, evangelical. Um, there are pastors who are awake, and there are pastors and priests who are asleep because even though they know the theology, their view of the world is based on what they're watching on CNN, MSNBC, and other mainstream networks. Therefore, they cannot really connect the Bible to what's going on in the world because their worldview is falsified by the mainstream media. Until they step outside the box of mainstream media, they won't get what's happening. That applies to the majority, but I do believe that more people are waking up. I think that it's on the increase for sure. For one thing, we have truth on our side. The enemy doesn't. So the media broadcasters, the politicians, they constantly have to prevaricate and make up reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. They
Yes.
can't give an honest, logical reason that any critical thinker would accept. But unfortunately, there are many people who are, the people with Trump derangement syndrome, as they call it, that kind of person um, who just is immersed in what he's seen on television news.
That's very interesting. I find it kind of as a segue. The guys at the top, they fully understand this is a spiritual thing. They even practice their black magic, their arts, their
Right,
incantations. I got a book over here by Michael Hoffman, and he
right.
relates the beginnings of NASA and JPL rockets and all this, and it was deeply involved in sex magic and occultism, and even looking at when they were out there with the Trinity. They were part of the Trinity thing, and the bombs and all this, and the bombs, um, that they believed that they were bringing forth something new. The Golem, which is Talmudic, by the way. It is a Talmudic teaching, the Golem. And the their idea was they were bringing about a transition in the in this realm. And then you start looking at all that NASA does. They use all the old ancient gods is their symbolism, and you look at everything they do. It's tied backwards to the ancient arts, the ancient alchemy, the ancient civilizations, and the darkness that was permeating that time. And they've delved into that, and then they also incorporate all their dark magic. And what I'm seeing is, and Michael does a great job of pointing out that even assassinations, and we'll get into your book later on, but the assassination of Kennedy, where it was at Dealey Plaza, I actually was down there a couple of years ago visiting my son who just moved to Dallas. So we went over, I filmed it, took pictures, and looked at it and went, oh my goodness, look at this. This is a very unique situation. Heavily Masonic. Yeah, that's why it was Dealey. It was Masonic. And the Masonic Hall was right down the street. Nothing is by accident. These guys use numerology, they use dates, they use times of the year, they use different things. 9/11 was pulled off on a specific time and a date because they had to have this. This was part of their ritual because it was an inside job. It wasn't 19 guys from the Middle East. But
Right.
they pulled this ritual. Well, when they did that, let's just use 9/11. That shocked the world. And it immediately gave power to them because in shock, you're now able to implement your strategies of the security state, the empire. They did the same thing with COVID. They literally shocked everybody, and they were able to introduce the same more draconian security. But it's a spiritual thing. There's no way that most of us that day on 9/11, we just went, oh my God, what just happened? And we're trying to sort it through. The next thing you know, we're being told, oh, it's Al Qaeda. No one had even done any investigation. That's where that Zion thing, that's where Zionism, that's where Israel came into it. But that was a spiritual thing. They had already prepped, I believe they had already prepped the the atmosphere, the realm that we live in, to when they pulled the trigger and did that event, it ran shock waves, and they were able to introduce their next wave of control. They did the same thing with Kennedy. That shocked the nation, and Kennedy wasn't alone. His brother, Martin Luther, that shocked the nation. They allowed that, and then they used that as power, like a spell. They spell cast.
Mm.
So, does that ring some bells there? Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. 9/11 was a completely pivotal event um, for American history. And I actually was writing a book on 9/11. I had joined a group of scientists and professionals, included former Boeing captain, former flight controller, former Boeing engineer, and we were trying to sort out exactly what happened on 9/11. I realized as a blogger, I'd made some speculative mistakes on 9/11. And so if you go to my blog, you see some of my posts on 9/11, it's got a disclaimer at the top and it says, refer to this, because I had to change my mind on certain things. It was a very confusing situation. And one of the most challenging situations, one that we had still not worked out when I stopped writing. I stopped writing that book in 2019 when COVID hit, because I said, this is the new thing. This is the new thing, and 9/11 is going to fade in importance. So I never did finish that book. I'd written about 16 chapters, rough draft, but the book was still not half finished. But there were imposing questions. For example, the second plane, Flight 175, United, struck the second tower, according to the FAA, at 586 miles an hour, which is an amazing speed. Usually a Boeing won't go above 450, but he did come out of a steep dive. He's able to hit the building. Well, there was a airline, Meridian Airlines, and as you recall, after 9/11, all flights were grounded the next day. So the pilots had nothing to do. So the head of Meridian Airlines, his name was Dan Gavalos, who was a chief pilot. He said, "Hey guys, let's see if we can hit the Twin Towers in a simulator." So he put about 10 pilots on a simulator, and these guys all had thousands of hours of flying Boeings. None of them could hit the Twin Towers. They all missed. And yet, the guy, his name was El Shehi, who was supposedly piloting Flight 175, had never flown a Boeing in his life, not even in a simulator. And yet he made his strike. And same thing with Muhammad
Atta.
Atta. Atta was a psychopath, a drug addict. Yet he made a perfect dead center hit on the North Tower. And you know something? Those direct hits had to be guaranteed in advance. If they only skimmed the tower with a wing and landed someplace else in New York City, they couldn't have demolished the buildings. Those hits had to be guaranteed up front. But you know something? With these flight professionals, we went over every method of making this happen, including hijacking the flight control system, using the Boeing non-interruptible pilot. That would have caused a great change in the weight of the plane, and it would have to connect it to the ailerons and the rudder and every part of it. Um, we tried the instrument landing system, which enables a plane to land in a fog on that spot in London. We tried that, but we found it couldn't work on 9/11 because you have to have radar at the airport, which is constantly calibrated, and the pilot has to be totally tutored in that system. We tried everything. We tried remote control. We tried hacking the autopilot. We tried everything. The autopilots just weren't good enough to make an exact hit like that. They could fly within, say, 100 feet of a flight path, but not that exact. We never could figure out exactly how they got those planes to, and that includes the Pentagon, where a terrible pilot, um, who couldn't even fly a little Cessna 175 a month before, well, was able to hijack a Boeing and fly it perfectly. Perfect first strike on the first floor of the Pentagon. Every pilot hit his target exactly, except for the one in Pennsylvania that is said to have crashed early. There were so many things wrong with 9/11. It was a watershed moment. And, for me, a little bit spiritually, one of the original architects of the World Trade Center stated that the Twin Towers were meant to represent David and Nelson Rockefeller. When those two buildings were knocked down, and with the events that subsequently happened, I realized that 9/11 marked the end of the J.P. Morgan Rockefeller skull and bones dominance of American society. We're now going to become a Zionist society. We're now going to fight Zionist wars on behalf of Israel. And that was kind of the watershed moment for that taking place. And of course, I'm sure you've seen General Wesley Clark's video on Democracy Now, where he talks about how he went to the Pentagon and he was told, we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq. He says, well, any connection between Iraq and Osama bin Laden? And the general he was talking to said, no, nothing like that, but they're going to take out these 7 countries anyway, even though they had nothing to do with 9/11. Pretty amazing stuff that was going on. And so you saw that the picture was much greater. One interesting thing was there's so much to say about 9/11, and we can't go into it all here, but Osama bin Laden issued allegedly an official statement congratulating the hijackers on the success of 9/11. I read his statement, and you know what wowed me, and I shared this with other 9/11 researchers, said, something, you read Osama bin Laden's statement, he doesn't add one thing to the narrative given by the FBI and the American media. It's like he planned this thing. Shouldn't he have known something about 9/11 that the Americans didn't know? And of course, there's one of the things I ran into when researching 9/11 was, uh, our troops have Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda tracked in the mountains. And the commander, I'm going to forget his name now, but he wrote a book about it called Jawbreaker. Um, he he notified Washington, listen, we just need a few hundred more Army Rangers and we can get Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, no problem. Well, what happened? Not only did not get the Rangers, he was transferred to South America. They didn't want to get Osama bin Laden because if they got Osama bin Laden, the whole reason for all those subsequent wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, bombing Libya, bombing Syria, bombing Yemen, all that would go away. No, they didn't want to catch Osama bin Laden. They wanted him to get away. And the story was so much different. A lot of times sort of off the track, but 9/11 is still a big one with me. And the reason I was writing that book was I said, I don't want to do any more speculation. I want to go about 9/11 the way a lawyer would go into an honest courtroom. No speculation, strictly documented facts, provable to a jury. No more speculation for me. Some of my friends and I came up with some pretty clever speculation about 9/11, but it turned out to be wrong when I really investigated it hard. So that's what I was after. And that's kind of the way I look at life now. There are a number of theories out there in alternative media that are very speculative. And I try to stay away from those. I try to stay with things that are provable hard facts. Again, just as if there's an attorney in a courtroom, if I something that's hearsay or speculation, the judge is going to say no, objection sustained. That testimony is out. Strike it from the record. I want to be that kind of attorney. The attorney comes in only with provable facts.
That's very interesting. I've got it written down somewhere. I watched a video and it was by a professor, I think out of Vancouver, BC, or somewhere up in Canada. And he created a documentary and he said, I'm dying of cancer and I've been holding out on this for a long time. But he himself, being like a scientist, he went through and then he said, I'm going to get the primary documents. And he went and got the primary documents. It's like a 1,200 page, I don't know if it was an FBI or whatever, of where they sat down with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of witnesses of that day and took down their transcribed what they heard, what they saw. And he said that over 100, 130, almost 200 people all said there were multiple explosions within the building before it even came down, that these were all explosions. And he goes, I've come to conclusion using evidence that could hold up in a court of law that those buildings were all blown up. They were the planes, whatever that you wanted to do about that part, they hit it. By the way, proof that a plane can hit a skyscraper is you can go back and go to Wiki and look up when the Empire State Building got hit by a big bomber during World War II, I think it was. And it basically,
yep.
it took out a section. You got pictures of people there where the section was. Now the bomber hit it and it dropped. It didn't go into smithereens. But the fact is they rebuilt it and it's still there today. So those towers were built with the idea of having these being impacted by a plane. And so consequently, they would have held up. But this real eyewitness, it would hold up in court. They said, no, there was multiple bombs going off. And we've all seen the videos where the firemen are saying, yeah, it was like do, 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 do. And then I've seen Building 7. I've seen footage of that where you can see the squibs in the windows and you see that drop down. So we could spend all day on that. And I am still, Christopher Bolin is somebody that I really respect who did a.
Yes, amen. Amen to that, yeah.
And he's kind of disappeared. I don't know if he passed away or he's just said, I've got to get out of here. I'm moving on because he got threatened he got threatened by Mossad. He got threatened because he tied the Israel connection there. And
He was the best. Can I mention something quick about him?
yes, yes,
1 week after 9/11, he already was reporting on the dancing Israelis. I didn't learn about the dancing Israelis till about 1 to 2 years later after 9/11. 1 week after 9/11, he was already on top of the dancing Israelis. He was, I think, the most astute, unique 9/11 researcher, and I saw him twice giving talks on 9/11. He was magnificent. He did. He was in Sweden. He had a fairly large family, and but you're right. I've had the same question. What happened to Chris Bolen? I mean, he was almost up there in the top five of people you'd be looking at in alt media, prior to COVID. And now you don't. His website's still up there. Last time I checked, you don't see him add anything new. So I really don't know what happened to him. But I think he probably was a little too close to the truth.
I do too. I think he's one of the most stellar um, individuals. I've got Crossing the Rubicon by Michael, and I forget his last name. He actually committed suicide. Um, uh, but again, when you spend the money and you buy the books and you read it, and I didn't know about all this. I came later on, and I'm one of these later on kind of guys. But I wanted to shift gears now, and let's talk a little bit about your your um, your work with the shadow government. The and let's talk about that. But how that led into the formation of even the modern day nation of Israel, because a lot of the same forces, as far as I can see, were kind of working together. We know about the Balfour Declaration. We know that early in the 18 or late in the 1800s, they were already working to buy land over there, part of the Project for Zionism. And then there was the Kalergi Plan, which came out of Britain, which was let's divide up the world. And then there is later on, I think it came out in the 80s, the Greater Israel Project. And I'm looking at what's going right now, and to be honest, all those countries that we bombed into oblivion it after 9/11 are now working together, and now they're fighting back. And I see that maybe the hand of God is in a doing something differently. I've heard some alternative Middle Eastern experts talk about that there's a whole change of guard that's going to be taking place, and we're seeing it right now all over with our finances, with everything. But let's go back to how Zionism, how Israel has played such a pivotal role in controlling and taking over our United States of politics.
Sure. Of course, Jerusalem was the city in which Jesus was crucified, and it's generally considered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims like to be the most holy city. Um, I was recently out as in Detroit, as I mentioned. I gave a talk on world wars, connecting World War I to World War II to what's going on today and the possibility of a third world war. And I pointed out the common denominators. One is obviously world government, because out of World War I, you had the League of Nations, which was the first formal attempt at a world government. It failed, was replaced by the UN, which was much stronger. And of course, John D. Rockefeller Jr. wrote out a personal check. How'd you like to do that? Personal check for $8.5 million on his own bank account to the UN to buy the land. But today, look at the World Economic Forum. They're talking about world government. They're talking about digital ID, universal. They're talking about how the countries of the world must unite to fight climate change. They would support the World Health Organization's initiative to have a global pandemic treaty, which would override national constitutions. So world government is a constant theme running throughout time. If you really look at the Bible, one will recall that God divided the nations after the Tower of Babel, keep the world from becoming too evil. It's like the devil's working against that all the time. Along with world government, there's communism, which is the form of rule they want. And World War One created the first communist state, the Soviet Union. World War Two then spread communism into China and Eastern Europe. And look at the World Economic Forum today. Now, I'm sure you don't have the picture right here, I don't think, but I'm sure everybody's seen it, where Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum say, welcome to 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Now, Karl Marx himself said the definition of communism was the abolition of private property. So what Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum are actually talking about is is communism, the abolition of private property. When they say you'll own nothing, that's what but they're not talking about their own private property. Bill Gates is not going to give up his mansion and his jets. They're talking about us. And that was true of the old Soviet Union. You know, Lenin and Trotsky used to eat meals off of solid gold plates, which are stolen from the royalty of Russia. They didn't live like peasants. They didn't live like the proletariat. It was for the little people. And uh, so communism, globalism, and then Zionism. So in World War One, you had the Balfour Declaration, by which England promised to take over Palestine, and that's largely what the movie Lawrence of Arabia was about. You know, it was about the Arabs were promised that they helped the British fight against the Turks, that they would get um, Palestine, that they would get control of it. It had been under Ottoman Turk control for 40 years. No, Britain had no business in Palestine. Um, Britain had never been there before, but the Zionists promised that they would bring America to the war in exchange for that promise. And so the British promised to invade and take over Palestine, even though it had no strategic significance during World War One, in return for this pledge from the Zionists. And it's kind of interesting that right after the Balfour Declaration was issued in November of 1917, then the Bolsheviks took power, overthrowing Kerensky. The Zionists wanted to um, make sure that the British government passed that before they struck and made the Soviet Union into the communist dictatorship that it became. The timing is pretty obvious. Just as with Woodrow Wilson, he withheld the American declaration of war until the Czars stepped down because Russia had been our ally in the First World War. And had he joined the war before the Tsars stepped down, it might have bolstered the Tsar's position and changed his mind. It's very interesting if you watch the sequence of events. But then continue with Zionism. World War II created the state of Israel. And I write a lot in Hollywood. It's interesting that in March of 1948, the Oscar for the Best Picture went to Gentleman's Agreement, which is all about the sin of anti-Semitism in America. You know, never mind the fact that the Nakba was taken that year, then the hundreds of thousands of Arabs were displaced. The big deal was that Gregory Peck, posing as a Jew, encountered some minor anti-Semitic remarks from his janitor and his girlfriend and his doctor. Okay, and they give that boring movie. My father was Jewish, but we watched that movie after being told that it was the best picture winner. Watched it on TV in the late 60s. Said, this is the most boring movie we've ever seen. How did it ever win an Oscar? Well, figured out. March of 1948, it got the Oscar. May of 1948, the state of Israel was declared. And 11 minutes later, Israel was recognized by Harry Truman, who, according to John F. Kennedy, had been given a $2 million bribe in a suitcase by Abe Feinberg, the founder of AIPAC. It all puts together. And now, today, we see that Israel is ruthlessly attacking not only Gaza and the West Bank, but they're bombing Lebanon, they're bombing Syria, they're shooting missiles at Iran. It's as if Benjamin Netanyahu is begging World War III to stop. Well, we've got our whole carrier force over there in the Middle East. Last time I checked, we had over 40,000 troops there and a lot more on the way. It looks like we may be headed into that third world war that was predicted by Albert Pike. it would begin with a war between Zionism and Islam. Um, and if you put all your troops over there, you could set off a nuclear war. America could be left defenseless um, with our troops overseas. And I just published today a blog post on the coming election. I was going to do it on illegal immigration, which I think may be the greatest threat we're facing right now. But when I lost my computer, I lost some of my material. I didn't have time for it, so I said, I'm just going to do a quick post on the possible outcome of the election, which at this point is what, only 4 days away. But Zionism, globalism, communism have always been part of it. Capitalism too. I mean, World War One created billions of profits for banksters who promised they would make weapons for the front that they never made. And there was a 21-volume congressional report um, issued at that time, which history has forgotten about. That the bankers stole $6 billion from American taxpayers, while American soldiers were earning $1 a day fighting in Europe, risking their lives. $1 a day they got.
Yep.
And World War II, again, suppression of civil rights, the Japanese internment camps, the Great Sedition trial, and then, of course, ever since 9/11, you have the Patriot Act, COVID, taking away more freedoms. Now they have climate change, taking away more freedoms. So that is also part of reducing civil liberties. All of these themes run consistently: World War One, World War II, up until today, with the potential of a third world war. It's very consistent. They've really not changed. They've occasionally had to change a specific strategy, like they were going to make the United States join the North American Union, but people like Ron Paul and other Southern congressmen stood in the way of that. They didn't get away with it. But the basic plan for consolidation into a new world order with depopulation, world government, communism, and Zionism. Zionism, of course, intended to make Jerusalem the capital of world government. That was explained by the first Prime Minister of Israel, and David Ben-Gurion, in an article in Look magazine in 1962. It's all very consistent, and it's all very evil.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta understand, and then you got evangelical Christians who are dispensationalists who are just looking for this to happen. They are like, and of course, they believe that they're going to be raptured out of here before all hell breaks loose, but they're supportive, 100% supportive of Israel because they think that um, they still own that land, that God gave them that land. They don't understand what happened in 70 AD. You know, the average Christian has no clue what God did. That the Jerusalem that's there today was actually totally destroyed, dismantled, burned down, tore apart, and then rebuilt in 135 AD by the Romans, called a different name, and then the 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 wall was built, I think, a couple hundred years later by the Ottomans or somebody over there, as an outpost. But the idea that Israel was ever going to have a foothold in that region was never God's plan. His plan was to build the temple in you and I. The temple
Right.
is in you and I as humans, and it goes throughout the whole world. He doesn't care about real estate anymore. He cares about human beings. And it's very
Right.
interesting. I was reading somebody else was preaching on it, and I was looking at it, but there's one verse in the New Testament, I think it's in Thessalonians, it says that Paul's writing to the church, and he's saying, the Jews are contrary to everyone. They do evil towards everyone. And this is prior to the 70 AD. He's pointing out the destructive tendencies of Judaism, that this spirit, and it wasn't God's spirit, this is a demonic spirit. Jesus even says to the religious leaders who were oppressing the people, by the way, at that time, he said, you're sons of the devil. You couldn't be clearer about this stuff. The same spirit is working, I believe, today, has been working in all of Zionism. This is not just a person, well, I'm Jewish by birth. This is what I am, but I'm just going to be a good person and I'm going to go to church or I go to synagogue or something. No, no, no. This is a teaching that goes back thousands of years that teaches that basically anybody who isn't Jewish is lesser. They're an animal. Talmud teaches these kind of things.
Mhm.
But it's not new because even if you go back, I was reading this, and here's I'm going to flip on this. Even the Roman Catholic Church put out the papal bull, the Doctrine of Discovery, and said if they don't convert to Catholicism, you have the right to take their land and kill them. And that set things in motion. I've got the whole. You can look up Doctrines of Discovery, and it's there. You can see their writing. It's about 1200 A.D. or 1400, just before Christopher Columbus sailed. They put this in place. Well, that's the same kind of attitude. See, this is a spirit thing. That same demonic presence came into the church and said, it's fine to kill your neighbor. It's fine to rape, pillage, and plunder your neighbor. And that's like Jesus says, love your neighbor, pray for your enemies, do good, be willing to be a martyr. But that changed. So I'm thinking the same demonic spirits are working within the church. They're working within Zionism. They're working together. They're colluding because today now 50 million Christians or more believe that what's going on in over in the Middle East is all prophecy, and that God's going to be there and he's going to protect Israel. And we got the flag of my church has one, an Israeli flag in their church sanctuary. And I'm like, what is this? We're not supposed to be worshiping the gods of our government. We're not supposed to be putting these standards in the front of I don't care if it's a Russian flag or an American flag or a Zion flag. We're there to honor God and to worship God. We're not there to honor our governments and to worship those structures. And so it's strong delusion, brother. It's strong delusion.
Right. Well, I read the 4,000 pages of the volume set called "The Lives of the Saints of the Orthodox Church," and it's drawn from hundreds of manuscripts from Ireland to Greece to Russia over 2 millennia, and there were no Christian Zionists. Never was a saint who was a Christian Zionist. They didn't exist. And if anything, what they would describe as the enmity between the Jews and the Christians, there was Jews would burn down the Caesarea when it became a Christian city. If a country was under the control of the Turks, they would falsely report the Christians to the Turks, so it would be killed. There was no Judeo-Christianity and no alliance, and that only happened, with the basically with the Schofield Reference Bible and the Balfour Declaration, both of which I think not coincidentally occurred in 1917.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then Christians, especially the evangelical churches, after the Pope rejected the idea, the evangelical Christians started to support the idea of Zionism, and somehow Zionism became intermingled with Christian theology. And even though the Apostle Paul said there's neither Jew nor Greek, but we're all one in Christ, suddenly the Jews have this separate road to salvation because of the DNA. And it was our duty as Christians to protect the political state of Israel, which is very interesting. Originally, Israel, the political state of Israel is going to be called either Zion or the Jewish state, but they decided to call it Israel because trick people, it's semantics, but trick people think this is the ancient Israel of the Bible. And so to support, if you believe in the Bible, you have to support Israel. It's very tricky, but we're supporting murder, and we've also been supporting people who have attacked us many times. Was the attack of the King David Hotel, Lavon affair, the attack on the USS Liberty, the attack on the LaBelle discotheque, which led to Reagan to bomb Libya, and of course 9/11, which Israel was heavily implicated in.
Yep.
They've been our enemies all this time. And, some people would even tie him to the Kennedy assassination. But after he demanded that he dismantle their nuclear plant, um, uh, it's been horrible. And you're right, it's demonic. Um, and I think that there are actually literally demonic forces. Um, when at the time I was researching 9/11, I heard an interesting statement by there's David Ben Noon of Israeli News Live. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has a
Yes.
pretty good
Yes.
show. Him and his wife Jana, and he's been in Israel. He has a lot of contacts over there, and he said there are people in Israel with an IQ of 1,000. He said an IQ of 1,000. I said, that's unheard of. These must be kind of some sort of fallen angel or demonic entity he's talking about. And I asked him more. I said, did these people have anything to do with this conundrum of 9/11? Is it because there were people who had some sort of intelligence that we don't even fathom? And he got an answer, but it's a very confusingly worded answer. And I couldn't make heads or tails of it. But again, COVID came along and I couldn't pursue that effectively any longer. But yeah, I believe that we're dealing with very demonic forces that are trying to create greater Israel, place the abomination of desolation in the temple, as the Apostle Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 2. These times will not happen until the man of lawlessness is revealed, setting up himself in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. I think that's going to happen, and the dispensationalists will see the Antichrist in God's rebuilt temple, as they will call it, and think that Jesus come back for his 1,000-year millennial reign, when in fact it's the Antichrist coming for his very brief reign. I was in evangelical churches. It was one of the things that drove me away as I started to see that these things were not true.
No, yeah, this is how this is how they phrase it. This is how they believe. And I'm like, that all got taken care of. That whole thing. I'm reading the works of Josephus right now, and boy, does it just open your eyes to say, yeah, the Bible was written prior to 70 AD. Everything that's being taught um, is telling you this is going to happen. Jesus said this is going to all happen, and it did. And there was even chariots in the heavens that were flying around. There were signs and wonders that were going on for like a year in advance. And Josephus is writing this down. He's not even a Christian. He's just telling you the accounts of what was going on. And then he says, truly, truly, the providence of God is in this. This is judgment. There's no other explanation for this. And he says it again and again and again, how the Romans could come in and they did this. And the Jews that basically late 60s, the factions within Jerusalem, there were different gangs, basically gangs, mobsters, and they were slaughtering one another, and they were slaughtering the people. They were pillaging, they were plundering, they were burning things down, they were stealing things, and this was going on before the Romans even got into Jerusalem. There's accounts of they're going down going down roadways, and they're having to cross over on top of bodies, and they had opened up a house and it would be stacked full of dead bodies. And
Wow.
this was all done internally. This wasn't even Romans doing this. This is internally going on. And that's what God was warning about, that this is judgment. And he warned even back in Deuteronomy, if you look at the passages, they're already there. All the prophets prophesied about that day of judgment, and that day of judgment came for that nation because again and again and again and again they turned their backs on God. They turned their backs on God again and again and again. And he said there's blessings and curses, and when you go away, there's going to be the curses. And ultimately it all surmounted. But Jesus had to come first, and then there had to be that 40-year period between him, his ascension, and the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the same thing between Moses and Joshua entering in the promised land. There was that 40-year period. So these all were taking places. We don't even know these things because we don't know history. And then you start reading history and you start reading accounts and going, oh my goodness. And then there was a guy named Julius I forget his name. I got the PDF on my computer. He didn't like Christians, and he told the Jews, "You can go ahead and rebuild the temple." It's like 300 AD, 200, 300 AD, somewhere in that area. Oh,
Julian the Apostate,
yes,
perhaps.
Julian the Apostate. So the account is they started moving things around, and the ground basically split, and fire came out
Well,
and consumed some of the build workers, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we're not going to touch this place again."
right.
God's not going to allow any temple to be rebuilt. The temple is you and I. He's not going back in time. He's not doing Back to the Future, like the movie. We are at the future, but the reality is we do still live in a world that's demonically controlled. And I'm not a preterist, 100% preterist, because they believe that that's all gone away. There's going to just be the evil of men. And I'm like, no, 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 no. There's too many things going on here to just dismiss the spiritual things. And speaking of which, one of the things I did want to talk to you before we talk about the assassination of Lincoln is I want to talk a little bit about your miracles, your saints and the miracles, and the missing saints, the missing miracles. Talk to me a little bit about that, because we only have our history that we know. And you said you read like 4,000 pages of
Yeah.
Orthodox history, and I suspect your book came out of that. But talk to me
It,
about
it,
the history of the saints and the history of miracles, and because there's the Eastern, there's the Western, there's the Protestant, there's the Independents, and everybody's just no one connects with each other anymore. We're so ignorant of the lives, the beautiful saints who've gone before us, who paved the way. And I think your book's probably going to cover some of that. So talk to us about that.
okay. Well, when I was attending evangelical churches, which was for a good 30 years, I was told that no miracles occurred after the book of Acts. That there weren't any miracles after that, and they can't happen after that.
Cessationists.
And uh, then after I became Orthodox, and I read the works of Saint Paisios of Athos in Greece, as probably the most respected saint of the 20th century. He said, every day you should read for the lives of the saints. And I said, well, that sounds like a good recommendation. So there's 7 volumes, and I picked up one of them and I began to read. And I was reading about, an ancient saint from, 1500 years ago, and how he raised the dead or healed the blind. And I said, wait a minute. Jesus said, the miracles I do, you shall do also. And I said, wait a minute, there were miracles. And I started cataloging them. I started writing them down, and I found that there were saints who turned water into wine, who made him help fishermen make a miraculous catch of fish, healed lepers, raised the dead, several who walked on water, right up until uh, I would say the 19th century, crossing the Jordan on water. And this was coming from hundreds of manuscripts in different languages from different centuries. So it wasn't like they were colluding with each other to make up some fabricated story of miracles. But there was something. So I have a chapter which catalogs these miracles, when they took place and where they took place. But I have another chapter, which is the character of the saints who did these miracles was remarkably faithful. There was no such thing as a casual saint who did a miracle. There was a casual churchgoer never did a miracle. These were people who gave all their possessions to the poor, who lived in a state of complete self-denial, um, a lifestyle that's kind of unimaginable to us today. But this is the kind of person who gave up everything, denied himself for Christ. That kind of person could do a miracle. That kind of person could turn away a storm like Jesus did on the Sea of Galilee. And I said, that's why people think miracles don't happen anymore, because we've gotten away from that strict obedience to Christ, which as Paul said, I'm the first of all sinners. I'm guilty of this. I said at the beginning of the book, I'm not a saint. I'm a million miles away from these people. But
Amen, brother.
I said, I mean, even worthy to write this book. When I prayed about it, I thought God said, if you don't write it, nobody else is going to write it. So you go ahead and write it, you're not worthy. So, but I found that there were countless miracles done. Uh, I think that virtually every miracle Jesus did, or even the moving of a mountain, which he only mentioned, were actually done at one time or another by saints of the Orthodox Church. And that would include the early Catholic Church, because the first 1,000 years, the two were united. Um, and I'm sure Catholics would have other examples that they would give as well. Um, so that's what it's basically about, is that miracles did occur, continued to occur, just as Jesus said they would after the book of Acts, but they only occurred through people who were in a state of self-denial and utter obedience to Christ. There was no compromise or halfway there. They were fully obedient. And that's basically the point of the book. And I also talk a little about Western Christianity and how we made this mistake of splintering into all these different denominations until Christianity became basically unrecognizable. But we forgot about the East. We forgot about Eastern Orthodoxy, which was in Greece and Serbia and Russia. It had basically remained unchanged over these centuries. And actually, when you go to an Orthodox church, you'll find they're using the same worship service that was used in the 4th century when Constantine first legalized Christianity. It's pretty amazing to see. But for me, the more I've been involved in history, the more I've seen you kind of have to go back to the original to find the truth about things, and that's holds true, I think, very much for the Christian faith.
I have a good friend of mine who has become a Russian Orthodox and priest, and he's forming his own. I think last time I chatted with him, he's not too far from where I'm living, and they were going to a farm and going to make a place out there for their church building. And then I know Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible Answer Man, became Orthodox, and so there is a movement. And I understand the underpinnings of that completely. I'm tired of all this layer upon layer upon layer of inventions. I just want to go back to the simplicity of what life was and what worship was and what the body was, and the entanglements that disentangle what's going on. But I do know that the Russian Orthodox has been heavily involved with state for centuries over there, so they have their problems too. There's no perfection there, but I think what you just told me, though, about the saints who did the miracles, it reminds me of what the prophets in the Old Testament lived like. They lived on the ragged edge. They lived on the ragged edge. They gave up their life. God says, you're going to be naked and you're going to walk around, and this is a sign for the nation of Israel that they're naked in front of me. You're going to do this. You're going to go do that. And it's like, what? And they did it. And then Hebrews talks about the Hall of Fame, and that was just a brief little Hall of Fame there. But they lived selfless, and I do know about some of the saints. I was listening to somebody share about not Saint Germain, but he's pretty well known in the Catholic Church, but that he could speak to the animals,
Yes, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But again, he had given up everything, and his whole life was about serving and its selflessness, and that even individuals within, like you said, into the 19th century, even within Protestantism and evangelicalism, the individuals who gave up everything are the ones who really, really affected people that things started from. Today, it's all a machine. I mean, you can plug and play any church, anywhere you go. Same style of music, same lighting, same style. Everything is a plug and play, and it's like it's no wonder that we're so strongly diluted, because we are removed. I've been really focused, by the way, on really helping my small group Bible study allow the Spirit to live through you. You know, we've been crucified. It's no longer us. It's Christ who lives through us. And if you're not bearing that fruit, you know, of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, etc., then you're not bearing the fruit of Jesus. You're bearing the fruit of something else. And, you know, we do sin, but I go, if your theology and your belief system counters these fruits, then you have to do a check. Is my belief system aligned with the very teachings of Scripture? And where the saints that you're talking about, the ones that you've cataloged, they lined up with Scripture. They were the poor. You know, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the humble, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. James, of recently, I've gone, what does it mean to be mourned? Blessed are those who mourn. And I thought, well, it's a loss of your loved one. And then I think really since this whole escalation of Israel against Palestine and me seeing Christians just going haywire and supporting it, I've become a griever. I grieve every day. There's not a day I don't grieve over the world that we live in. I was listening to Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, who picked up the mantle and has been supporting Palestine for decades.
Yeah.
He says, I cry every day. He says, there's not a day I don't cry. And I go, I get it. The saints of old, the saints who were in touch, they do a lot of grieving. They're not, we enjoy the joy of having our salvation, but there's grief that goes along with understanding the truth. And you even wrote a book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And it kind of reflects that. When you really dig into the truth, James, you become a loner. You're not, there's not a lot of people who really want to hear the truth. They're too invested in deception and falsehood. And if they had to face the truth, it would mean giving up a lot of their positions, their job possibly, giving up their possessions possibly, giving up a lack of, you know, making less money. And think about all the pastors, James, who would, if they decided, they woke up tomorrow, and God literally said, stop preaching dispensationalism, stop promoting Zionism, that's not me. And they go, they would probably be fired from their denominations. Because
There would be. I was kind of shunned in one church I was attending because I started to drift away from these things. And so even one of my best friends wouldn't do me a favor. I asked him because, you know, I was sort of persona non grata in that church. But in a way, it was a good thing because it got me out of that church and made me seek until I found orthodoxy. By the way, I want to agree with something you said. It's not a matter of being in the Orthodox denomination that would say you can do these miracles or you find God's favor, because you know you'll find the good and bad people in every denomination, and you know there are Protestants and evangelicals who have gone to Africa and lived sterile, poor lives, far poorer than I have. So, and God knows, you know, it's not for us to judge other people. It's a judgment entirely in God's hand. He knows who belongs to him and who doesn't. But I think there are good people the world over, and God knows that. So I don't like to catalog anybody on the basis of denomination at all. But I just think that the Orthodox Church is probably the denomination that stuck to the original form of worship most closely.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So I want to segue because I've got a little time left with you, and I want to segue into your latest book because, you know, you wrote a book. I had a couple authors on my show in the past, and we talked about Lincoln. We talked about the aggressiveness. We talked about
Lorenzo.
With that?
Thomas D. Lorenzo.
Yeah.
Was on your show. Yeah.
So what I find interesting is there was the beginnings of the American Empire, was what started the war of aggression against the South, because people say, well, it was about slavery. I'm like, you know what? Britain had already passed a bill and passed a law in 1807 that said it was illegal to have slaves.
Mhm.
We could have done the same thing here. It might have taken a little longer, but it would have done. It would have passed. It would have become a
Would have
reality.
happened eventually. Yeah.
So it really wasn't about slavery. It was about consolidation, what you were talking about earlier, we've talked about earlier, consolidating and removing states' rights, removing individual rights.
Right.
And
Mhm.
and not only did they consolidate the states, then they went on a rampage and started just killing and slaughtering the American Indians and
You're
stealing
right.
land from Mexico and everybody.
Before we make the segue into the Lincoln assassination, can we take a quick break? Maybe
Go
two
ahead.
minutes?
Go
That'd
ahead.
be okay? Yeah, I think would be a little better for me.
Yep, go ahead. Just leave yourself there and take off and come back.
Yeah, okay.
You don't have to pause anything there. So I'm going to stay here, folks. You can keep listening. James is going to take a break here, and we're going to be right back. I hope you're enjoying what we're doing here. There's so much to think about. I've got let's see. A great book is this one, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare by Michael A. Hoffman. I was talking about his works, and he talks about Kennedy, but he goes into the great detail of explaining that occultism is how the elites, how the guys at the top of the pyramid operate. They use magic, they use occultism. He and another guy came out, Revelation of the Method, which is basically these guys, they pull off a 9/11 and then they go neener, neener, neener. We got away with it, and there's nothing you can do about it. So a lot of what we see in the news is the individuals at the top saying, we got away with it. What are you going to do about it now? It's like Netanyahu. We're getting away with it. What are you going to do about it? There's nothing we can do. But that's a very, very powerful book. It's a small read. Secret Societies, Psychological Warfare, Michael A. Huffman. But again, he's one of the individuals who I've, he talks about, he utilizes and the whole, the whole connection between occultism, numerology, and dates and times. Now, you and I don't care. I don't care what day it is. I don't use astrology. I don't follow any of that. But the point is they do. So those who worship Satan and what I call Luciferians, dates have a big, big part to play in their life. And world events are done by certain dates. There's certain things that go on that are all done by dates. And that's just one aspect I can share with you. I was like, I'm not sure if I've got any. The other one is I've got Laetril. I've got a bunch of books here at the office, and I got a ton at home. But another thing with the COVID-19 thing, and we didn't talk about that much with James' book, but again, folks, if you're listening to this, probably a lot of you have already woken up to the whole that was manufactured. My book, Breaking the Deception Code, I go into detail into that, which, by the way, I am changing the name, and I'm going to republish it, and I'm streamlining it, changing some things. But I just want to let you know that there's truth. James is a great guy. He's been speaking a lot of truth, and I'm appreciating the time that I get to have with him because he's been out there since '86 writing about this, and I'm just a newbie, so I'm making up a lot of time for having him on here and enjoying him. So we'll get his volume back on. We'll get his audio going here, and we'll pick up again with. We're going to get into. Here we go. You hear James?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I was just telling people about Michael Hoffman's book, Secret Societies, Psychological Warfare, and to me, it's a great primer because you understand the world that we live in, and the whole part and parcel of the supernatural. He talks about that too. But believe me, the people at the top, and we're going to move into Lincoln, but they fully understand this stuff. I don't know if this is true or not. I was listening to a teacher, and he was talking about occultism, witchcraft, and everything, and he said, um, General Patton and General MacArthur were both occultists, and he quoted something, and I'm like, so I went on and I tried to do a Google search. You're not going to find anything about it. So I'm like, well, next time somebody teaches that, I want you to do the chapter and verse for me. I want you to show me citations, because I love citations, James. I think you do too. When somebody tells me something, my book has citations in it, and whenever I write, if I can get citations, I will put it in there so that I have something to back it up. You need good endnotes. You need good citations, and that's going to segue into your book about Lincoln and the assassination. And first of all, why cover this? What got you involved with thinking about Mr. Booth, Mr. Lincoln, the assassination? What was behind it? Because I have heard different people over the last couple, 2 or 3 years I've listened to have alluded to that there was a whole lot more going on there than we've been told. So what got your dander up to make you go back and say, I'm going to take a look at our own history and Lincoln and the assassination and all that that means? So kind of just give me the
Yeah.
setup before we get into the details.
Okay. So back in the mid 1990s, I was studying the Civil War in depth. I was reading many memoirs. I read the writings of Lincoln, the writings of Jefferson Davis, and many individuals who were involved in the conflict, diaries, etc. And it culminated in my writing an article in 1997 for Southern Partisan magazine, after which I moved on to Darwin. But there was one book about the Lincoln assassination I read in the 90s. I found it on a library shelf. It was called Why Was Lincoln Murdered by Otto Eisenschimel. And the book blew me away. Um, he dismantled the entire mainstream narrative. He'd done remarkable research, hands-on archival research. He had found rare books and magazine articles that I think even today people wouldn't know about if he hadn't found them. The legwork he did was amazing. He talked to the descendants of people who were involved in the Lincoln assassination, as well as even people who were still living from that time. I was amazed, but I didn't cover it in an article for Southern Partisan. But the points he made were so ringing that they always stayed with me. And so this January of 2024, I was saying, well, what should I write about next? I said, I've got to go back to Eisenschimel and say something about his book, because nobody ever covered Lincoln like Eisenschimel, his assassination. And so I went back and I reread the book, and I found he'd written a second book in 1940 called In the Shadow of Lincoln's Death. And then I said, well, if I'm going to write an article, because originally this was going to be a blog post, not a book. I said, I've got to see what other authors are saying since Eisenschimel. I read a lot of conspiracy books, a lot of mainstream books, but there was one author named Don Thomas, who absolutely blew me away also. He wrote a book called The Reason Lincoln Had to Die, and he wrote another one called The Reason Booth Had to Die. And I got in touch with him, and he'd been through the archives as well, monumental research. And I said to him, hey Don, I noticed in your book you never reference Eisenschimel. Is something wrong with that guy? Is something you didn't like about him? Was something wrong with him? He says, no. So I've never read Eisenschimel. I said, that's amazing, because you guys went through the archives and you reached almost precisely the same conclusions. So he and I became great friends, and I'm indebted to him because he pointed out to me many resources that are available online today that were not available to Eisenschimel when there was no such thing as online. And so I found that by using archive.org, I'm very grateful to them, many, many books and magazine articles written more than 100 years ago can now be found, and they are digital. You can digitally search them looking for a specific name.
I
And
love the
within
tool.
seconds, yeah, within seconds, you can find somebody that would have taken you weeks before to find. You would have to travel to a library and go through their paper catalog and all of that. And so it was when I first started writing in the 1980s. Um, in any event, I also found that Eisenschimmel had come under vicious attack by modern mainstream historians to the point that they're really lying about the man and trying to attack his character because they couldn't defeat his facts. And so the more I got into this, and I found that even the um, War Department files pertaining to the Lincoln assassination had now been digitized, and you could search them automatically and look for any name or word. And that was amazing, and it really accelerated the writing of this book. Uh, it's called the Exploding the Official Myths of the Lincoln Assassination. It came out in July. Um, so that was kind of what's behind it. I wanted to bring to light the points that Eisenschimmel had made and that Don Thomas had later made, adding some insights of my own that I discovered. In fact, there's some that it seems that no historian, conspiracy or mainstream otherwise, has covered that I do mention in the book. And I wanted to make these available to the public in the interest of clarifying, because again, a lot of attention gone on the Kennedy assassination in recent years, but not too many people paying attention to Lincoln, but there was a lot going on back then.
What I find interesting is what I like what you just said. You came across an author who, after you reading several books, you came across Eisenschimmel and Otto, and you're going, "Oh my goodness, this is just like primary documentation. This is stuff I've never seen before. This rings true." Then you kind of shelve that, and you come back, and then you come across Don Thomas's book, and you're going, "Wow, he's drawing the same conclusions." He probably read Eisenschimmel's book, and then you talk to him personally. He says, "I have never read that guy. I don't know who you're talking about." And you're like, where there are two witnesses
Mhm.
now, two witnesses who came to the same conclusion, but they
Mhm.
didn't know each other. I use that a lot when I'm looking at things. I'm like, where there's one or two witnesses. One, okay, they brought something forth. When you bring another one over here and they haven't talked, they don't even know about each other, and they come to the same conclusion. Now my eyes are wide open. I'm like, I need to check this out because these guys didn't talk and they came to the same conclusion. I mean, that's how a lot of great inventions happen. That's how a lot of great transitions happen. But when you just said that, I mean, a little chill went up, and I went, wow, you've got two individuals who used what they had to do their research. And that got you probably going, okay, I'm on the right track here. And then, like you said, you needed to go about doing it yourself, combining what they did, what you've done, and you've probably put it into a shorter, easier read. Would I be correct on that?
It's only a little over 150 pages, so yeah, it's a pretty quick read. Yeah.
So let's go back to the whole. I know if folks just go read anything, listen to a couple of the shows I've done in the past about Lincoln and the War of Aggression and all that. I get into that enough here, but Lincoln played a pivotal role. I believe, he was brought into that position to do a certain task. That task got accomplished. He could have gone on and continued to live, and who knows what would have happened. Why do you believe he was taken out?
It's very specific. Lincoln had been tyrannical during the Civil War. He shut down hundreds of newspapers that disagreed with him. He put elected legislators in prison for disagreeing with him. But he grew weary of the war by the end, and he did not want to punish the South when the war ended. But there were people in the North, and these politically were represented by what they call the radical Republicans. These are the most left wing elements of the Republican Party, which was not at all like the Republican Party of today. In those days, the Republicans were the leftists and the post-socialists, and the Democrats were the conservatives. It's weird how it's changed over the course of more than 150 years, but that's the way it was. And Lincoln did not want to punish the South with what we now call Reconstruction. He wanted states restored with voting rights. He wanted them restored to Congress. He did not want to punish the South. Now, the radical Republicans wanted Southerners to be hung. They wanted them to be denied voting rights. They wanted them to be under military occupation. They didn't, and this actually happened under Reconstruction. They were not allowed to elect their own governors. They were under military governors appointed by the War Department, and the South was brutally exploited. Homes were seized, businesses were seized, cotton was seized. If you remember from Gone with the Wind, remember Scarlett O'Hara, the taxes on terror are $300, and the only way she's got to get it, she has to go to Rhett Butler, and she puts on a dress she made out of curtains in the hopes of getting $300 from Rhett Butler. That was really going on in the South. They were seizing property. The South was to be economically exploited, but Lincoln stood in the way of that. He said, let the people keep their property, let them vote, and let the states be returned to the Union. Well, that was too much for the deep state of the North, which was represented by the radical Republicans. So Lincoln had to be assassinated, but it had to be done in a way that the South would be blamed for the assassination, and thus Reconstruction would be made even more brutal. And the main man politically involved with this was Edwin Stanton. This was the man fingered by both Thomas and Eisenschmidt, and who I 100% agree with. He was the one who took charge of the investigation. He was the one who denied Lincoln the protection he sought at Ford's Theater on the night of the assassination. Stanton was a radical Republican, the most important one. He was the one who was behind the attempt to impeach Andrew Johnson when Johnson started to decide to be softer on the South instead of brutally punishing it. And he lost by one vote. He actually was dismissed by Johnson, but he barricaded himself in the War Department behind armed guards, refusing to leave his cabinet position until the impeachment failed by one vote, and he was finally forced to step down. But this was definitely a northern plot made to look like a southern plot. I think we should probably go over some of the mainstream details of the assassination, just so people remember what we're
Right,
talking
please.
about. Yeah. So the South essentially ended on April the 9th, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to USS Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. That effectively ended the Civil War, but there were still a few Confederate troops in the field. But 5 days later, April the 14th, President Lincoln went with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, to Ford's Theater to watch a play called All American Cousin. And John Wilkes Booth, a very famous actor, Lincoln had seen him perform at Ford's Theater, went into the presidential box, fired a shot into Lincoln's back of his head, killing him. Now, General Grant was supposed to attend that performance, but he was a late cancellation. So, as a replacement, the Lincolns asked friends of theirs, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancee Clara Harris, who was the daughter of a New York senator, to sit with them in the presidential box. Now, when Booth fired the shot, Major Rathbone leapt to his feet. He grappled with Booth, but Booth stabbed him with a Bowie knife so deeply they cut an artery. Then Booth jumped onto the stage, but ironically, his spur, because remember he was going to make his getaway in a horse, his spur caught on the American flag draping the ledge. He fell down so awkwardly that he broke his leg on the stage. But when he got up, he shouted, "The South is avenged," and shouted the state motto of Virginia. Semper Tyrannis does always attains. And he raced out the back door. Now, people wonder, well, why didn't they stop him? Well, it's because people didn't understand what had happened yet. The shot was fired when the audience was roaring with laughter. That was by design. Most people didn't really hear the shot. They didn't fully understand the president had just been killed. Booth escaped by a couple of seconds. And at the same time, something people will forget was that a simultaneous assassination attempt was made on the life of the Secretary of State, uh, William Seward, who was
Hmm.
bedridden from a recent very serious carriage accident. An accomplice of Booth named Lewis Powell went into Seward's home, stabbed him in bed several times, and escaped. He was not the secretary was not expected to live, but he did. Booth escaped south into southern Maryland with a riding companion named David Harold, but that broken leg was just killing him, So he had to divert off his intended path of escape to a country doctor he slightly knew named Samuel Mudd, who reduced the fracture, made a homemade cast for it. Booth continued on his way, but is really slowed down by this injury to his leg. Finally, 12 days after the assassination, April 26, 1865, Booth and Harold were cornered in a barn by a detachment of Union cavalry. Harold surrendered, but Booth refused to come out. Against orders, Booth was mortally shot by one of the soldiers, so he was never brought to trial. The aftermath was that 8 Booth alleged co-conspirators were tried, 4 were hung, and 4 were sentenced to prison hard labor. And that basically ends the official story, except for one thing I need to mention because it ties into the Lincoln assassination. Booth's original plot was not to kill Lincoln. The original plot with his accomplices was to kidnap Lincoln and to bring him south, hold him hostage in exchange for Confederate POWs in sort of the last hopes of salvaging the South's hopes. And on March the 17th, 1865, about a month before the assassination, uh, Booth and his accomplices were waiting on a deserted stretch of road, waiting for the presidential carriage to go by so that they could capture Lincoln, bring him south for this purpose. But Lincoln canceled his travel plans that day, so the plot fell through. This is important because Stanton would later take these accomplices in the kidnapping plot and claim that they were accomplices in the murder plot, which almost all of them were not. That's the official story, but there are a gazillion holes in it, and we can walk through those.
It
The whole
it
of the official story.
it kind of reminds me of oh boy, it just these stories. Yeah, there's a guy named Paddock, and he's up in a room. There's Ruby and Jack Ruby and the the guy that's proclaimed as the killer is killed, and all these loose ends just tied up really quickly and forgotten and moved on. I mean, isn't this kind of like 101, take over a narrative, slough it underneath the rug, and then go on to do what you're going to do? Kind of, I mean, that's an aside that just came to me. It's like, boy, I've seen this pattern done again and again. We just kind of 19 hijackers, that's it. Now we're going to go to war. Never mind, we don't do any investigation of the actual place. And so anyway, go ahead and step into why this is important and what are some of the things you covered without giving away your whole book, but just some of the highlights and why this is important for us to understand.
Okay. Um, the first question I usually like to ask is, why is it that General Grant decided not to go to Ford's Theater that night? Um,
Oh well, that day he had a doctor's appointment. He couldn't make it to the one of the twin
I
towers.
think that's uh, Larry Silverstein.
Larry Silverstone.
But
Yeah.
with Grant, Grant told Lincoln that he wanted to visit his family. But as Eisenschimel pointed out, there was no urgency to visiting his family. Nobody was sick. Nobody was about to get married. He just as easily could have taken the morning train the following morning and seen his family in New Jersey. But Grant canceled out and he took the night train, and it was while he was on the train they learned of Lincoln's assassination. Now, mainstream historians have a spin on absolutely everything connected with Lincoln's assassination. So the mainstream spin on this is that Grant's wife, Julia, didn't get along with Mary Todd Lincoln, so she pressed her husband not to go to the theater that night.
Oh, I've heard that.
However,
Yeah.
yeah, the fact of the matter is, all they're being asked to do is to sit in full view of the public in the presidential box with Lincoln's. There's no chance there's going to be a cat fight between the two women under those conditions. The real reason Lincoln's expected uh, co-attendee Granton canceled out was that he went to the War Department that day. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, told Grant, "Do not go with the Ford's Theater tonight. It will be very dangerous. It will invite disaster. Please don't go to Ford's Theater tonight." So that's why he canceled out. Now, Lincoln himself didn't want to go to Ford's Theater. I'm going to quote his own bodyguard, his daytime bodyguard, William Crook, in his memoirs, quote, "I was surprised when on the late of the afternoon of the 14th, that's the day of the assassination, I accompanied Mr. Lincoln on a hurried visit to the War Department. I found that the president was more depressed than I'd ever seen him, and his step was unusually slow. Mr. Lincoln said to me, 'Crook, do you know I believe there are men who want to take my life?' Then after a pause, he said, 'I have no doubt that they will do it.' The conviction with which he spoke dismayed me. I wanted to protest, but his tone had been so calm and sure that I found myself saying instead, 'Why do you think so, Mr. President?' 'Other men have been assassinated,' was his reply. All I could say was, 'I hope you're mistaken, Mr. President,'" end quote. Now, Cook stood outside the entrance to the War Department while Lincoln went in. He spoke to Stanton. Stanton said he shouldn't go to Ford's Theater, but not with the same urgency he told Grant. Lincoln told Stanton he wanted a good bodyguard that night. He said, "I want to take your assistant, Major Eckert. I've seen Major Eckert. I know how strong he is. I've seen him take iron pokers and break them over his arm." So Stanton told Lincoln, "Sorry, we're going to be busy in the War Department tonight. I can't spare Major Eckert." Lincoln didn't accept this, and he went to Major Eckert at his desk, and he said, "Major Eckert, I'd really like you to be my bodyguard tonight at Ford's Theater. Would you please accompany me?" Eckert said, "Sorry, Mr. President, too busy." Well, two things about this. Number one, it's very unusual for a major of the United States Army to refuse a request from his commander in chief, the President of the United States. Lincoln said to him, "Look, couldn't your work wait till the morning?" And Eckert said, "No, no, it's got to be done tonight." The second thing about it is that Eckert and Dan are both lying to Lincoln. They were not busy in the War Department that night. They were not even in the War Department that night. And Stanton revealed the truth of this, not realizing the truth would later come out. He acknowledged that he went home, had dinner at home, stayed at home until he heard about the Lincoln assassination. And Major Eckert was not in the War Department that night either. So, well, who was Lincoln's bodyguard? And in my book, I call this "Worst Bodyguard Ever." His bodyguard was John F. Parker. Now, John F. Parker was a member of the Metropolitan Washington Police. He'd been charged with misconduct many, many times for being drunk on duty, being asleep on duty, visiting a brothel, um, using his gun inappropriately, using foul language, but somehow he found himself on the presidential bodyguard detail. What you need to know is he deserted his post that night. Shortly before the assassination, he left his post. He went next door to the Star Saloon and began boozing it up. He was not at his post when Booth pulled the trigger. And he did not show his face again until 6 o'clock the following morning, when he brought in a prostitute who gave her name, probably an alias, as Lizzie Williams. Now, the Washington police weren't interested in charging her with prostitution. They were trying to find Lincoln's murderers. They didn't care. This is like a pathetic effort to save face by John F. Parker. Now, some people think that Parker actually spent the night with the prostitute, and that's actually credible because he was known to frequent houses of prostitution. And why would he bring a prostitute at 6 o'clock in the morning? That would mean he arrested at about 5:30. No prostitute is out then plying her trade. Furthermore, no prostitute would be out looking for Johns on the night after Lincoln's assassination, because the street was wild with violence. There were lynch mobs, crowds threatening to burn down Ford's Theater. No prostitute's going to be out under those conditions. Now, you'd think, what happened to John F. Parker? Surely he went to jail for deserting the president. Shirley was fired. No, no reprimand whatsoever. He actually stayed on the presidential bodyguard detail even after he deserted the president and let him be shot. And Mary Todd Lincoln, when she saw him still at the White House, shouted at him, "You're responsible for my husband's death." Now, granted, she was a high strung woman, but she was right. Now, here's what William Crook, the honest bodyguard, the date that I quoted before, the daytime bodyguard, said that Parker should have been at the rear of the president's box, quote, fully armed to permit no unauthorized person to pass. Incredible as it may seem, he quietly deserted his post of duty. It was through this guard's amazing recklessness, to use no stronger words, that Booth accomplished his foul deed, end quote. William Crook. He doesn't lose his job. There was an inquiry by the Metropolitan Washington Police, but all charges were dropped, and he was allowed to stay on the police force in the presidential bodyguard detail. Now, this is quite amazing, and it required clout from somebody with a lot of influence. Now, just in case you think that this is because the people investigating Lincoln's death were soft touches, the man who investigated Lincoln's death was the same man who denied him the protection at Ford's Theater, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton.
Oh,
Now, Stanton, you can break it any time, by the way. I'm be over talking. Stanton appointed himself head of the investigation of Lincoln's assassination. It should not have been him. It should have been the Attorney General. Lincoln was a civilian. John Wilkes Booth was a civilian. But Stanton said this must be an act of war by the Confederacy. He had no proof of that, but he said, since it was an act of war, therefore I, as Secretary of War, shall take charge of the investigation. Now, he let Lincoln's bodyguard completely off the hook, but I would just contrast. I want to show what happened to a man named Ned Spangler. Who was Ned Spangler? He was an employee of Ford's Theater. He worked there as a carpenter and scene shifter. Scene shifters would people who would shift the scenery around between acts while the curtain was down. Now, what was this crime? This crime was this. John Wilkes Booth rode up to Ford's Theater before the assassination on a horse. It was not a horse he owned, it was a rented horse. And the stable owner named John Pumphrey told Booth, said, "Mr. Booth, watch out for this horse. He's very high spirited. He could break away on you." Now, Booth wanted to make sure that horse was going to be waiting for him when he came out from the assassination. So he called a Spangler who he knew. He knew Spangler not as a co-assassin. Spangler had worked at Ford's Theater for years, and Booth had performed there for years. He knew him on a professional basis. He said, "Ned, I got to go into the theater for a couple of minutes. Could you hold this horse for me?" The Spangler said, "Okay, Mr. Booth." So he holds the horse for a couple of minutes, but then time's a wasting. He's got to get back into the theater to do his work. So he says to another employee named Joseph Burroughs, "Hey, Joseph, would you hold Mr. Booth's horse for me? You want somebody to hold him his horse." That's it. That's the extent of his crime. Now, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, orders Spangler's arrest. He's placed in solitary confinement. His legs are manacled. His arms are handcuffed at all times. And Stanton invented a unique form of punishment. All the people he accused, including Spangler, everybody except the one woman accused, Mary Surratt, had to wear canvas bags over their heads. Now, they couldn't see, they could barely hear, and there was just one small hole for breathing and eating. And they were kept in solitary confinement for weeks on end, not allowed to speak to anyone. Even the guards were forbidden to speak to them. And the bags wouldn't come off the head even for meals. Now, for Spangler, the guards took pity on him, and they weren't supposed to help him, but one guard would stand and watch it, and another would feed him through the hole in the bag. And this continued for weeks on end. And a doctor warned Stanton, these people could go crazy from this. They've done experiments on sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation will make you go crazy in a short amount of time. Well, that's what all of these people accused by Stanton had to undergo. Now, another question about the assassination is this. Booth went into the presidential box with a one-shot Derringer. That was his weapon, a single bullet, and a knife, a Bowie knife. Why was he so sure he only needed one bullet to kill President Lincoln. He knew. Um, he had a competent bodyguard. Lincoln's bodyguards were always equipped with 38 Colt revolvers. If a competent bodyguard had been in his post, he could have stopped Booth. Booth would have had to use that one bullet to kill the bodyguard, which would have left him with only his knife to kill Lincoln. But to get to Lincoln, he would have to get through Major Rathbone first. And then killing Lincoln would be no easy task because Lincoln was 6'4", very strong, former rail splitter. Booth was only 5'8". And by the time he got to Lincoln, all kinds of rescuers would have come into the presidential box. So this indicates, I'm just going to suggest it to you, I can't prove it, that Booth had foreknowledge that there wasn't going to be a bodyguard. The presidential box was also prepared in special ways to facilitate the murder, which I won't go into at this moment, but which Booth clearly knew about. Now, in case people think that Booth didn't have inside information, I'm going to prove he had inside information. I mentioned before that an assassination attempt was made against the Secretary of State, William Seward, that same night, simultaneous to the Lincoln assassination. Now, Booth's accomplice, Lewis Powell, how did he get into Seward's home? He pretended to be a pharmacy delivery boy. He said, I've got medication from Dr. Verdi. He knew the name of Dr. Seward's physician. The servant was kind of suspicious and tried to say, said, I'll give it to him. And Powell said, no, I'm supposed to deliver this medicine myself. He knew exactly where the stairs were. He knew exactly where Seward's bedroom was on the third floor. He had inside information. It was definitely inside information which had been given to Booth and his accomplices that night. Another weird thing, and I'll stop after this because I want to get your own feedback, was what I call the weird selection of Booth's targets. There were only two prominent people in Washington who opposed the plan of Reconstruction that brutalized the South for 12 years after the war. Those two people were Abraham Lincoln and William Seward. And Abraham Lincoln and William Seward were the only people where actual assassination attempts were made that night. Now, mainstream historians will say, oh, well, they also planned to kill General Grant and they planned to kill Secretary Stanton and all these, but none of those assassinations came off. They say, well, the people chickened out and it didn't happen. No. Something very interesting is that after the war, after the assassination, after the war, Lincoln's assassination was mourned in the South because they knew that this meant that they were going to be brutally punished. And as proof of this, I want to just quote President Jefferson Davis of the South. He said, quote, it will be disastrous for our people. Robert E. Lee condemned it. Virginia newspapers called John Wilkes Booth a scoundrel. Years ago, back in the 90s, and I went back and got this book, Sarah Morgan Dawson wrote a 440-page book called The Confederate Girl's Diary. And the final words of that diary were, quote, our Confederacy has gone with one crash, the report of the pistols fired at Lincoln, end quote. You see, down south, everybody knew what the assassination meant and meant brutal Reconstruction. Now, in contrast to that, I'm going to quote how the radical Republicans reacted. These are the representatives of the deep state of the time. George Julian was a radical Republican congressman. Here's what he described in his diary, undisputed passage in his diary, April the 15th, just hours after Lincoln passed away, which was at 7:22 that morning. Quote, I like the radicalism of the members of this caucus, but not for a long time I heard so much profanity. It became intolerably disgusting. Their hostility towards Lincoln's policy of reconciliation and contempt for his weakness were undisguised. And the universal feeling among radical men here is his death is a godsend. It really seems so, for among the last acts of official life was an invitation to some of the chief rebel conspirators to meet in Richmond and confer with us on the subject of peace, end quote. And I just want to mention one more thing about that. There was a movie made in 1915 called Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
E.W. Griffith directed that film. It was highly advanced for its time, its methods of cinematography, but it's sympathetic to the South. And in that movie, it shows that after it shows John Wilkes Booth assassinating President Lincoln, but it shows in the South people are mourning Lincoln's death. But when the man called Stoneman, who clearly represents Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, the movie even says he's from Pennsylvania, he just kind of smirks when he hears of Lincoln's death. So that was 22 years before Eisenschimel wrote his book. They didn't get it from Eisenschimel. It was well known that in the South they mourned Lincoln's death because he was a man who stood in the way of Reconstruction, the brutal economic exploitation of the South. Lincoln was killed because of his opposition to that. John Wilkes Booth should have known that the two men he was attacking were the two men who stood in favor of the South. Instead, he attacked the only two men who opposed the exploitation of the South. I'll stop it there. There's so much more of this in my book, and that can be said, but I'll just stop it there because I've probably been talking for too long.
Well, it's interesting because do you think that Booth got paid off then? If he
This is
was
a
a
very interesting question, and I have a kind of a unique section at the end of my book. It's called "There's Something About John." Now, John Wilkes Booth was definitely a Southern sympathizer. I say this, actors are actors and they can put on a fake persona for a while. But John Wilkes Booth had been a Southern sympathizer since before the war began. I mean, going back to 1859, 1860, there's no way he could have foreseen that someday he was going to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And I cannot believe that in the letters he wrote, the arguments he had with his friends and family, that he was faking his loyalty to the South. But there is strong evidence that on the day of the assassination, Lincoln had a meeting with several men, 5 men. They were supposed to meet Lincoln, supposed to meet Booth down south. They never showed up. And from what's left of Booth's diary, which was grossly mutilated, we can get into that. Booth thought he was one part of a massive assassination attempt against Lincoln's cabinet. He'd been suckered in. He thought that his job was just to take out Lincoln and Seward, and that the rest of the cabinet would be murdered by these other men. After he went south, he looked in the newspapers. He found that no other assassinations had occurred. And one of the men was supposed to meet him down south, came down there. He'd been double crossed, and he was shot and killed to keep him from talking. I think he might have gotten away had it not been for that broken leg that slowed him down so much. But he was shot and killed in that barn to silence him. You were talking about some of the comparison with Kennedy. It's very similar to Lee Harvey Oswald being shot and killed before he could go to trial. Very, very similar events.
I just find it very interesting because he if there was going to be a huge cabinet assassination, then it was like, okay, we're just going to take out all the buggers that got us into this thing and we can start fresh. But the fact is it was only the two individuals that were standing in way of the terrible 8 years that was going to follow. And I don't think people that so my former guest, he was talking about the brutality of Sherman
Mhm.
and
Definitely.
Grant. They were just massive. They love killing. They just love killing. They love the brutality, and the troops went along with it. They loved it. They pillaged. So there was a huge hatred towards the South by the North, and that I suspect that the not only that was a top-down thing by the cabinet. You just pointed out that they hated the South. Kind of like what we see Israel hates Palestinians. I mean, the same spirit. By the way,
Mhm.
there's Israeli authors and experts who've been writing about this, who talk about the indoctrination of the children of Israel from day one all the way up, and they use the Holocaust, they use other things, and they convince them that everybody wants to kill them, and then they say you got to kill them first. So in the North, there must have been a huge hatred towards the South overall. That it even warranted them even to think that it was worthwhile going to battle towards the people in the South. I mean, I can't even imagine. It's like, Steve, I live in Washington. You need to go down to Oregon and kill those people because they want to secede. They want to have their own independent state, and we don't. We want them to be part of it. I'm like, why can I care? What is that about me? I don't want to kill them, but there's had to be something in the water. I don't know. So that's a bigger picture of what's going on here, and that would kind of foment this whole idea in the first place.
Well, it didn't really make sense. Abraham Lincoln said that the document in history that he admired the most was the Declaration of Independence. What was a South secession but a Declaration of Independence? It was the same thing.
Yes.
And actually, I live in Massachusetts. You live in Washington. Massachusetts entered the Union by a very slim vote. It was 187 to 168. Imagine if a couple of years later, Massachusetts said, you know what? We don't really want to be in the Union after all. I think we'll stay independent. Can you imagine George Washington saying, Massachusetts, they're traitors. And I call upon all the other states to raise armies to invade Massachusetts. And I order the Federal Navy to blockade Boston Harbor. When Boston is captured, it'll be burned to the ground. Imagine nobody would have responded to George Washington. So what happened between George Washington and Lincoln's time? Nothing happened. Nothing changed legally, except that Lincoln had changed the perception that your entry into the Union was irrevocable, which it was not. I read the writings of Lincoln and the writings of Jefferson Davis, and I found that Jefferson Davis was a superior constitutional scholar. He read the ratification statements of every state that joined the Union, and several states, including New York, I should mention, specifically joined the Union with the provision that they could leave the Union at any time that they wished. Nothing changed between that time and the time of Lincoln, except the perception that once you're in the Union, you can't leave it. And the idea that why does Lincoln want to stay together in union with these people anyway? He hates them. He has them, the crops burned and those cities burned to the ground. Atlanta, Savannah, Richmond is destroyed. It's not because he loves the South. There is really no rationale to the war at all. The South wants to split. I know this, by the way, there's different arguments about this. Some people said the Rothschilds wanted to split the Union in order to divide and conquer it, and the Czar sent his navy over here, and that the Rothschilds hated Lincoln because he created greenbacks instead of borrowing money. Although the greenbacks did create inflation and gave the deep state of the time access to funds that they would have otherwise. There's different views on that, but there wasn't really a sufficient reason. Slavery itself would have ended on its own.
Yep, I believe that.
Um, um, Donald Jeffries, in his chapter on the Lincoln assassination, the 1860 census showed that less than 5% of white Southerners owned slaves.
Yes.
And, with the coming of modern harvesters and other agricultural equipment and modern kitchen equipment, you really didn't need slaves anymore anyway. It would have died out on its own anyhow. It wouldn't have lasted, and it wasn't worth more than 500,000 soldiers' lives, which is what the war cost, to have this war. This was more of a war like most wars done for the sake of the deep state.
I would say the same thing. And then back to your point that Lincoln at the end of this thing, it sounds like he had a change of heart. It sounds like even though he promoted and he was a purveyor of a lot of the evil, there at the end he's like, my God, what have I done? Kind of like that Judas Iscariot kind of, what have I done? Here, take back the silver. Too late, buddy. The it's in motion here. It's like that. I kind of, what you're painting is a picture of a guy that said I don't want to be. We can't. We got to go back. We got to. It's done. It's done. But we can't keep promoting this, and then the just like the religious leaders, the sons of the devil who used Judas, they said, "Not going to take your money. It's already in the works. It's a done deal. It's a sealed deal." Does that kind of ring with Lincoln maybe having a change of mind there at the end?
He definitely changed his position in the South. He didn't want further retribution. He'd seen enough people die. Um, if you look at the last picture taken of Lincoln, he looks pretty worn out. Um, he's kind of had it, and he doesn't want any more vengeance and more death and destruction taking place. But the people who were perfectly willing to continue with that, as far as they were concerned, he'd outlived his purpose, and he was expendable at this point. One other thing I just wanted to mention about the Lincoln assassination, I think it's kind of important for people to know. John Wilkes Booth kept a diary, and at the trial of his co-conspirators or alleged co-conspirators, the following was introduced in evidence: a knife belonging to John Wilkes Booth, his pistols, his belt, holster, file, compass, spur, tobacco pipe, carbon, cartridges, and bills of exchange from banks. But three pieces of evidence were not included. I'll mention the most important one was his diary. His diary was not introduced into evidence. It was kept a secret for 2 years. The only reason we even know about that diary today is that after 2 years, Secretary of War Stanton had a falling out with the head of the Secret Service, Lafayette Baker, because Lafayette Baker was caught by Andrew Johnson spying in the Oval Office, and Johnson said this man has to be fired, and Stanton let it happen, and that picked off Baker. So Baker wanted to make some money, so he wrote a book called The History of the Secret Service, and in that book he revealed for the first time for public knowledge that John Wilkes Booth had a diary, and the public was shocked, Congress was shocked. They wanted to know what's in that diary. And I'm just going to quote what Congressman Benjamin Butler said. He said, "What I want to know is this: it was the good judgment on the part of the gentleman prosecuting the assassins to put in evidence the tobacco pipe, spur, and compass found in Booth's pocket. Why was not the diary in his own handwriting found in the same pocket put in evidence?" And Holt, and who was the judge advocate at the trial, and Dan said, "Well, we didn't think it was relevant." Not relevant. How could it not be relevant? This diary revealed there was no plan to kill Lincoln until the day of the assassination, which meant that some of the people who were sentenced at that trial couldn't have possibly known about the assassination because they weren't even in Washington for weeks prior to that. It was very, very relevant. And I just want to mention, and this was brought up by Tom Thomas, Eisenschimel didn't know about it, of course, because it hadn't happened yet. But in 1977, the FBI's forensic library was asked by the National Park Service to do a forensic examination of John Wilkes Booth's diary. Here's what they found. I'm quoting the report, which you can find online. Quote, "In total, there are 43 full sheets, 86 pages missing from the diary. They found that the immediate 25 pages before the assassination were removed." And again, quoting the FAA report, quote, "it was noted that many of the remaining edges of the group of 25 missing pages include portions of handwriting which, if these missing pages were later found, would assist in any future examination relating to these pages." In other words, these were not simply blank pages torn out of John Wilkes Booth's diary. These are pages he was written on. 86 pages were missing from the diary. It was withheld from evidence. Now, mainstream historians try to defend this. They say it wasn't relevant, blah, blah, blah. And John Wilkes Booth himself must have torn out those pages. No. John Wilkes Booth was keeping that diary as his own form of protection. If he was caught, this would prove that he was tied to people in Washington. Well, there's so much more that we could say, but this is one of the most key elements to understand: is that his diary was kept a secret, and when Congress demanded it, they found that many pages had been removed, would have incriminated certain individuals in Washington, and those, of course, would be the people who had possession of the diary, namely Stanton and his cohorts in the War Department and the radical Republicans.
You know, there's some corollaries here. I think about the Epstein files. No one gets to
Mm.
see those. I think of Heidi Felice's, the Washington Madame who ends up suicided at her mother's trailer park. No one has those diaries. I'm thinking of the of those two cases, and then there's the recent situation where down in Nashville, in that region, there was the transsexual individual who went in and shot up the schools. Well, that person had a journals. No one gets to read any of that stuff. No one gets to see any of that stuff. This is a ploy by, I believe, controllers within the the network, which is broad within those who wish to keep things secret, because truths will be revealed if we let those out, and we cannot have those truths revealed. And then the other thing that, with a corollary of mine to what you're saying, is how Abu Ghraib and the prisoners in Abu Ghraib and the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. There's a whole book on the Guantanamo Bay I read, and I forget the name of it. I did a book report on my Substack. You can go there to see it. But they had the same thing. They had the hoods put over them for days on end. They were shackled. They were starved. They were treated like crap. And these were innocent individuals, because it turns out that everybody in Guantanamo Bay, it was a military, by the way, it's a military prison offshore. Therefore, they had no rights. There was no rights given to them. They had no rights like a normal person would have rights. And they were treated like dirt under the suspicion that they were part of a Al-Qaeda cell, a terror cell, when it turns out that most of these people were just rounded up by rival gangs or whatever, thrown at the military. Military takes them in, interrogates them, and they weren't guilty of anything. And yet they were separated from their families. They spent months and years there. And the book kind of talks about the different stories of the different individuals in there, and that even some of the military soldiers that were there, they left in disgust, and they lost all faith in humanity and how it's destroyed their lives. And then I'm reading that, and then a little name pops up. A name pops up who was actually standing there and saying that the soldiers were doing their duty and there's nothing to be brought against them. That name is the current governor of Florida, because his role prior to being a governor of Florida was the same role of my former guest on my last show. And their goal is to protect military personnel from being court-martialed or put in a jail for false offenses. But the role that our governor of Florida played was to protect those guards and the people involved in guarding those people in Guantanamo Bay for years and years and years and years and years and years. And then the interesting thing is that same treatment of the Guantanamo Bay was then done towards anybody that was rounded up for January 6th in our own jail system. Because I've sat in and listened to many different interviews, because I do podcasting production for several shows, and we've interviewed several of the guys that were imprisoned, have been in prison, and the same story. They got treated like crap. They got put in isolation, and they were not given a trial. The trials were put off forever. The machine that was back in those days is the same machine we have today. I hate to say, there's just far too many parallels. The same techniques.
Right. In 1863, Congress passed the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act, and tens of thousands of people were rounded up, thrown in prison without due process, no trial, and not even told the charges against them. So that's very much like January the 6th. So that shows you, over the course of 150 years, not that much has changed between the way our federal government responds to people who are dissenters.
Well, we saw that with Waco, Texas, when they murdered
Yes.
70 people at Waco at the Branch Davidians. They could have arrested David um, anytime when he comes to town. And then we saw that with Ruby Ridge. And interestingly enough, a lot of people do not know this, but in 2019, I believe it was 2018, 2019, 2017, somewhere my mind is. I used to do a show called Hog Radio. It was all about motorcycling, and we got to know quite a bit about the motorcycle 1% group and stuff, and then mostly the ministries, the biker ministries that minister to the one percenters that are reaching out to teach them the gospel, try to bring them to Christ.
Hmm.
And well, there was a thing called the National Coalition of Motorcyclists, which is a group who basically it's all the one percenters and all the ministries all come together once a year and have a big powwow and just discuss how to keep a lid on things, how to work with each other, what's your rights and what's your legal rights against the law, what's your legal rights as an individual. It's more about freedom. It's more about what's your constitutional rights. Well, anyways, there was a group of bikers that came back, and they had the group had met in. They were coming back from the annual gathering, and 100 of them met at the Twin Peaks in Waco, Texas, and we're having a beer and eating food. And these are people who had all been together at the convention. I've been to one of those conventions. I've met these people. Everybody was civil. Everybody's fine. All of a sudden, supposedly, one of the guys pulls a gun on another one, and ensuing firing takes place. By that time, there's police surrounding them, and a bunch of them got taken out with headshots from the outside. They all got rounded up, put in jail, and they were there without for over 100 days, without any just like you said, the habeas corpus, they suspended it. So they sat in jail and had no way of talking to anybody on the outside. They lost all their rights. They all lost their jobs. And I believe it was a complete setup. Once again, it was they had gone after this target group, and it was a federal state roundup. And so I've witnessed this stuff here in the United States.
Right. Yeah. What you're saying makes sense. And by the way, I think I did read about that a few years back. I've forgotten about that particular incident until you mentioned it. I knew less about it until you mentioned it now. But yeah, but this has been going on for a very long time. These kind of tactics. One of the things about January 6th was, of course, that the feds infiltrated. According to one
Oh,
Congress estimate, was that at least 200 feds were in the crowd on January the 6th. Well, the same thing happened with John Wilkes Booth. His group, after some of his original kidnappers abandoned him, he was infiltrated by feds who were pretending to be, pro-Southern. And so they were able to manipulate a lot of what's going on. Again, it was infiltration by feds. So again, a tactic that's been used for more than 150 years.
well, I shake my head only because nothing's new under the sun. The same tactics. The power brokers they want to stay in there. I do write a lot about the machine called Washington D.C., and I don't care who you put in there, with the exception of maybe one or two people. They're bribed. They're given money. They will do whatever their sponsors tell them to do, and they love big government. They love big war. They love big pharma. They love all the things that you and I do not love. They love, and again, it's a reflection of Satan's kingdom versus God's kingdom, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. On the other hand, murder, strife, envying, orgies, lying, deception. That's the operation of most governments. They just, this is how they operate. And I don't know too many people who can go in there who aren't clean, who after 4 years, either they go, I can't stay here anymore, or they have a strong stomach and they refuse, or they're ousted because they don't go along with the program. And I got a feeling the same thing was going on in Lincoln's time. You just told me that he had a change of heart, and his co-partner had a change of heart and they didn't want to go and see any more damage. But the rest of them, they were part of that machine and they said, no, we're going to take our pound of flesh. Besides, we're going to make a heck of a lot of money. We're going to reconstruct. We're going to subdue them and they're going to make in our mold. And but besides, we got to go conquer the rest of the frontier, and we need people to do that with. That may
Yeah,
have, think about that.
I'm sure that Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney and the late Congressman Jim Traficant would agree with you about how there's just a handful of people who don't go along with the system, and after a while, they're either done away with or they're forced out.
Just like you said at the very beginning, you talked with a couple individuals, and they were disappeared back through the Rockefeller. We're gonna take and break up the Rockefeller Standard Oil thing, and it says you're gonna go to oblivion. No one's gonna even know who you are, and that's what they do to these people. The machine eats and spits them up. Well, we could go on, but James, I want to say thank you for coming on. Again, tell people where they can find you.
Okay. My website is jamesperloff.net. Peter, Peter, ERLOFF, jamesperloff.net. I'm on Twitter as James Perloff, but I am a ridiculously shouter band. I am like 99% shouter band, so people don't see my tweets. I'm on trying to build a following on Gab. My books are on Amazon, except for the one I wrote on COVID, which they censored after 2 months, even though it sold over 3,500 copies in that time. It's selling well for them. They didn't agree with their viewpoint, so they got rid of it. But my other 7 books are available on Amazon. And you can contact me through my website at jamesperloff.net.
Yeah, and that's how I got a hold of James, was through his website, and he's really good about responding. So, James, I want to say thank you for being on here, and folks, I want to thank you for following the show and listening. And make sure to like the show, share it with all your friends, and as I like to say, remember, be a lion. That's what James is. He's being a lion. He's not afraid, and not the prey in a world of hungry jackals and vicious wolves.
Thank you very much. I appreciate having me on. You